Hello there, GB here, and welcome to Fast Forward, where I follow up on episodes of the main Rewind Classic Movies show to look at what happened after those iconic movies came out. That might be sequels, prequels, or sometimes just other connective tissue of those involved. Today, we're diving back into the neon-soaked, smoky, rainy world of Blade Runner to look at everything from the 2049 movie sequel to the TV series that came out in 2021. Did you know there was a TV series? Video games and the upcoming 2099 Amazon TV series. If you listen to the main Rewind show AJ and I did about the 82 Blade Runner, you'll know he loved it and I didn't. I don't have a favourite scene, but I'll give you my least favourite.
Really? God.
I think I said I couldn't wait for it to be over, but there's some good things to be said about these modern offerings. The prequel shorts. Let's start with the trilogy of short films that came out to build up to 2049 and introduce the state of the world and some of the characters. I watched these just for this, and you can think of them as the cinematic breadcrumbs leading you to the main course. They're probably only going to be watched by the hardcore fans, and I'll touch on these without going into too much detail, but there's not really any spoilers to give as such, as they lead into 2049, but also they're so short that there's no big reveals to uncover. Blackout 2022. The opening few moments introduce a story that's dark and intriguing, with replicants being strung up as humans try and eradicate them. It's a bit like Terminator 2, as everyone goes to war and a small group of replicants try to wipe out Tyrell with a nuclear missile to destroy a replicant database and secure their freedom. It is anime, and the animation is a bit inconsistent, but the story's good and explains the blackout referred to in 2049, and Edward James Olmos returns incredibly briefly as Gaff. 2036 and Nexus Dawn. This is live action, directed by Ridley Scott's son Luke, and featuring Jared Leto as his 2049 character, Nyanda Wallace. He meets with lawmakers, including Benedict Wong, to try and convince them to let him build new replicants. It's only 6 minutes long, and ultimately nothing more than an exposition scene that isn't needed in 2049. 2048 Nowhere to Run. Another live-action short directed by Luke Scott, which opens with a nice hook of Dave Bautista's character crying in some very vibey strobe lighting. It basically shows him protecting a mother and daughter from thugs on neon streets, and was written by the same guys who wrote the main 2049 feature film, as was Nexus Dawn, actually. It does help set up the tragedy of his appearance in the movie set a year later, but actually while it adds to the sadness, it detracts from the uncertainty of Gosling's character going to confront him. It also features a fleeting cameo from Mythbusters' Adam Savage, if you look closely. All in all, these shorts are interesting, but not essential. You can watch them all in about 20 minutes, so if you like the movies and just want a little bit more, they might be worth a watch. Black Lotus. Then there's the animated TV series Black Lotus. This came out in 2021 and ran for 13 episodes. It takes place in LA in 2032, 10 years after Blackout 22, but before 2036 Nexus Dawn, and focuses on Elle, a young woman with amnesia, as she uncovers her identity in a conspiracy involving replicants. Standout names for the English voice acting here include Brian Cox, Josh Duhamel, and Peyton List, but I have to be honest, I haven't watched this yet, and with the episodes being just over 20 minutes or so each, that's like 4 hours of viewing I'd have to squeeze in, and really, it's the one that least grabs my attention. The trailer, which has some modern pop song all over it, makes it look a bit like a video game, and the whole thing seems a bit like a Lara Croft crossover with Cyberpunk. On Rotten Tomatoes, the series has a rating of 71% based on 7 reviews, which suggests that not a huge amount of people have watched it either. However, there was a 4-issue comic sequel in 2022, and apparently another volume to come in 2025. The video game. I paid £1.79 for the game Blade Runner Enhanced Edition. I had no idea what to expect from this game, as I'd never heard of it, and it turns out it's worse than I could have imagined. It's a point-and-click adventure from 1997, so old that it plays in 4:3 ratio. I literally played it for 5 minutes before losing interest. You play as a Blade Runner called Ray McCoy, and for some reason it starts investigating the death of a cat or something. It got pretty good reviews back in the day, but in 2024, you're unlikely to love it unless you already played it and enjoy the nostalgia. Some of the actors from the film to make cameos in the game are Sean Young as Rachel, James Hong, and Joe Turkel, who comes back as Dr. Eldon Tyrell. But I didn't get far enough into it to see any of that. I also noticed a game called Blade Runner 2033 Labyrinth in the Steam store, which was meant to be coming out relatively soon, as it was announced in 2022. But right now, it seems it may never happen, as there was some kind of mass resignations among the team making it. Blade Runner 2049. Released in 2017, this film picks up 30 years after the events of the original and cost $185 million. That's $155 million more than the original. I'll get into how much money it made, or spoiler alert, lost, later, but all that money did pay for two huge actors, a visionary director and one of the greatest cinematographers on the planet in Sir Roger Deakins. Ryan Gosling takes over the lead Blade Runner job role, being all cold and emotionless, yet somehow emoting more than Harrison Ford did in the original. Ford eventually rocks up in the last hour doing his best. I'm too old for this. That's Murtaugh, isn't it? It's not Ford.
He reads.
As Gosling's replicant helps him find the lost miracle daughter he had with the now dead replicant, Rachel. Spoilers, by the way, if you haven't seen 2049. The last hour might sound like a big chunk of the movie, but it's just the third act because this is almost 3 hours long, which is basically an hour too much. And Ridley Scott agrees. He didn't return to direct it, but he stayed on as producer. And he publicly came out and said it was too long and too slow.
Too long. I'd have taken that half an hour.
Taken over in the director's chair. Don't know why we popularised the term director's chair. If you're directing, the worst thing you can be doing is sitting down, surely. Anyway, I digress. Taking over as director is Denis Villeneuve, who did films such as Sicario, Prisoners, and perhaps more famously, 2021's Dune Part 1, which bored me so much I thought about leaving the cinema, and 2024's Dune Part 2, which, surprisingly, I have not seen. Coupling a director like Denis with a legend like Deakins promises a lot in the visuals department, and 2049 absolutely delivers. It's a stunningly beautiful movie with plenty of iconic shots. I'm not sure it's a continuation of the aesthetic that Blade Runner established, although it's not strictly the same locations, I suppose. There are times, such as when we're in the LAPD office, where it feels too bright and well lit for Blade Runner and looks more like other less inventive futuristic movies. We talked about how the original had water-based lighting in the main show that didn't make sense but looked very cool in the Tyrell building, and they're back here in the Wallace building that basically takes its place in the story. Also back is another ridiculous scene with someone directing a computer camera with their voice.
Move forward. Go to 5. 7, move forward.
This time it's Ryan Gosling controlling a drone instead of Ford analysing a photo. Speaking of VFX, there's a sex scene where Ana de Armas' AI hologram and Mackenzie Davis's real-life flesh and blood prostitute merge so they can both get it on with Gosling. And it required incredibly complicated planning and wizardry, but the result is incredible and groundbreaking. There's some great 3D performance scenes with Elvis and Marilyn Monroe that's wonderful to look at, but it does kind of take you out of the movie. Although it does fit the continuity of how the original was grounded by mentions of Atari and Coca-Cola and whatever. We see a digital recreation of a young Rachel from the original, which is haunting for Ford's Deckard character and looks pretty great, although actress Sean Young wasn't pleased at not being super involved.
They knew if I wasn't included, I'd bitch about it.
In fact, there's a whole lot more history around the original's real-life relationships than we realised when recording the main episode. She came out to say that during filming in 1982, Ridley Scott desperately tried to date her and she said no. She seems to feel that her rejecting him resulted in Ridley holding a grudge and not wanting to work with her ever since, and killing her character for 2049, so she wasn't in it, bar the 30-second cameo, which she was paid for, was all a bit awkward and nasty.
I'm not saying Ridley's an asshole.
By the time Ford is reintroduced later in the movie, you sort of forget he's meant to be in it because Ryan Gosling's story is interesting enough. but I don't know if he's playing an older Deckard or just Harrison Ford at this point. I do often wish modern movies were a bit slower and take their time, but I got to be honest, I watch some of this at 2 times speed. I'm familiar with doing that from video editing, so it's something I'm used to, although I don't really do it for watching movies apart from this one. And I have to say, even at 2 times speed, still slow. Hans Zimmer takes over music duties from Vangelis and keeps things pretty similar in the ambient synth world, but it's far less jarring and dated. I still don't imagine AJ putting the soundtrack on in his car, but it's a more pleasant, if perhaps slightly more bland experience. But I kind of enjoyed the whole film far more than the original, and just found its story more engaging. I connected more with the characters and actually had empathy for them, something which I didn't really feel in the 82 version. The original was like watching a bunch of cold-hearted characters from the point of view of someone equally dead inside, whereas this time around we're actually helped to feel loss and pain and even hope at times. Oh, and it also has Jared Leto, who blinded himself for the role as the new Tyrell-esque rich replicant creator by wearing opaque contact lenses. I can just imagine Harrison Ford rolling his eyes and getting all gruff. He's like, "Just say the lines, kid." The biggest discussion point from it, though, will be a continuation of the biggest talking point from the first film, which is whether Deckard is a replicant or not. It's not explicitly made clear, although Ridley Scott has said he wanted to clarify that Ford's character is a Nexus model. Bizarrely, I've seen a few Reddit posts from people who say they watched 2049 and had no idea it was a sequel or that the original existed, which is bonkers. I suppose you could watch it and largely follow, but you'd be missing so much of the context, which I guess is just around Deckard and Rachel. But 2049 has pretty solid reviews, 8 out of 10 on IMDb, 88% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, 4.5 out of 5 stars on Amazon, and tens of millions in debt. It only made $270 million at the box office, which was far short of the $400 million it needed to break even with all the marketing costs. Many analysts say its underperformance was due to its slower pacing and complex narrative, which didn't always appeal to mainstream audiences, and its runtime also hampers how many showings cinemas can put on. Blade Runner 2099. Ridley Scott is returning to Blade Runner for a live-action series at Amazon. They continue to call things Blade Runner in the year, or the other way around, with the show set to take place 50 years after the movie sequel, with Ridley Scott executive producing and saying it circles the idea of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, whatever that means. They've been working on it for a few years already, having had the plot locked in since 2021, but there's no information yet on any kind of story. Meanwhile, says he wants to make more Blade Runner, preferably, quote, a detective noir story set in the future, which is the vaguest description of what Blade Runner already is, and he said he sometimes wakes up at night dreaming about it, so that's not particularly exciting. So why persist with Blade Runner? Despite failing at the box office, 2049 has since gained a strong cult following and is seen as a critical success in the sci-fi genre, I suppose. And despite the relatively modest box office earnings, the film's impact on the industry, its visual storytelling, and its enduring influence on pop culture has been significant, I suppose. Maybe Ryan Gosling will make a sequel in 40 years. Actually, can he? Didn't he die? Did he? Yes, I think he did. Although it's the movies, so you never know. Somehow, Kay returned. Anyway, join me next week when AJ and I will be back for the main Rewind show, where we'll be going to 1984 to talk about a movie I do love, where 4 blokes whack on boiler suits and one of them has sexual relations with a ghost who was a Playboy model. It's a bloody classic. Sorry about the mess. See you next time. Sorry about the mess. Sorry about the mess. Sorry about the mess.